The reports on the desk in Normandy did not add up, and the officer collating them for the German 7th Army knew it. Somewhere in the American 3rd Armored Division sector, a single Sherman kept appearing where no single Sherman should have been. It hit a column near a hedgerow at dawn. By midday it was reported miles away, knocking out half-tracks on a road that should have been quiet. Panzer grenadiers described a tank that fired before they saw it and moved through the bocage as if it knew the ground better than they did, striking in places too scattered for one machine to reach. If you find that hard to believe, so did he. And that is exactly why this story is worth your time. So hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me whether you'd ever heard the name Lafayette Pool before today, because most people never have. The German mind, trained on doctrine, reached for a doctrinal answer. One tank could not do this. So the reports must describe several tanks, a probing spearhead, a fresh armored formation working the flank. The analyst drew arrows on a map that assumed a unit. He was wrong. The arrows all pointed at one man. That man was Staff Sergeant Lafayette Greenpool of Odom, Texas, commanding a single M4 Sherman in the 3rd Armored Division. He commanded no company and no platoon, just one tank, one crew, and a tanker who had learned to read a battlefield the way the German officer read a report. The German model broke on a simple point. Doctrine expects the enemy to behave like a formation. With a formation's speed, its caution, and its predictable frontage, Poole behaved like a predator. He would spot a target, fire the main gun and the coaxial and the bow machine gun almost together, and be reversing behind cover before the return fire arrived. To a German gunner 200 yards away, that looked like being engaged by 3 positions. To the analyst reading it later, it looked like 3 tanks. The number in the title deserves scrutiny. Over 250 enemy vehicles and guns destroyed is the figure the 3rd Armored Division carried in its own records for Poole's crew across roughly 81 days of combat. Sources vary on the exact tally, and combat claims always run hot. But even the conservative accounting puts him among the deadliest tank commanders the United States Army ever fielded, and the men who fought beside him never doubted it. The Germans, of course, had no name to attach to the ghost. They had wreckage, burned Panzer IVs on the roads, shattered anti-tank guns still hitched to their prime movers, half-tracks nosed into ditches with the crews never having gotten out. A veteran of the Panzerlehr recalled, in a post-war account, the feeling of a sector where one had the sense of being hunted rather than fighting, the language of men who had lost the initiative to something they could not locate. That is the inversion I find so satisfying. The Wehrmacht built its reputation on the tank that appears where it is not expected, the Guderian thrust, the Schwerpunkt that shatters a line before the defender understands where the blow is falling. Just as the German Panzer had once haunted French roads in 1940, so too 4 years later, a single Texan in a mass-produced American tank haunted German ones. The teacher was being taught with his own lesson plan. The intelligence officer never solved his puzzle. He kept looking for a unit, because a unit was the only thing his training let him see. The answer was one Sherman, one crew, and a commander who had turned an ordinary tank into something the German army could neither name nor catch nor stop. To understand how a mass-produced medium tank became the most feared thing in that sector, we have to go back to Texas. Painted in white script across the hull of that Sherman were 2 words, "In the mood." Poole named his tanks after the Glenn Miller tune, and he went through 3 of them, each one christened the same way. In the mood, the second, in the mood, the third. The name was a joke to the crew and a signature to everyone who found the wreckage they left behind. Consider the machine itself. The M4 Sherman weighed roughly 33 tons, carried a 5-man crew, and mounted a 75mm gun that the post-war mythology insists could not touch a German tank. The myth needs qualifying. Against the front of a Tiger, the 75 struggled, yes. Against the Panzer IV, the flanks of most German armor, anti-tank guns, half-tracks and trucks, which is what a tanker actually met on 90-odd% of days, it was entirely lethal, and it fired fast. Speed was the point the Germans kept missing. The Sherman's power traverse could swing that turret through a full circle in about 15 seconds. A Panther's turret cranked by hand under combat stress, could take a minute or more. In a knife fight at 200 yards, the tank that gets its gun on target first usually lives. Poole's gunner, Corporal Willis Aller, got there first with a consistency that read, to the men on the receiving end, as impossible. For the German side, the arithmetic turned ugly. A single crew, working a single tank, was posting kill numbers that a German staff officer would ordinarily assign to a reinforced company. When the report said a company's worth of vehicles had been destroyed in a sector, the assumption was a company had done the destroying. The idea that 5 Americans in 1 Sherman accounted for the lot never entered the calculation, because no German doctrine allowed for it. The gap between the loss and the assumed cause is the whole story. The Wehrmacht was, by 1944, an army bleeding equipment it could not replace. Every burned prime mover was a gun that could no longer displace. Every dead half-track crew was infantry that never reached the line. And when the men filing those losses upward attributed them to phantom formations, they distorted the very intelligence their commanders used to plan. Poole was not just killing vehicles. He was poisoning the map. The crew understood exactly what they had built. Poole refused replacements he had not personally trained. He drilled the loader, Boyd, and the drivers, Close and Corriveau, until the sequence of spot, fire, reverse was muscle memory rather than thought. A tanker who fought near him put it plainly in a later account. The crew functioned as one man on one trigger. That line explains the ghost. One trigger, pulled faster and more often than the Germans believed one machine could pull it. There is a grim comedy in the German response if you step back far enough. Their solution to being repeatedly ambushed by what they thought were multiple tanks was to commit more force to the sector, more anti-tank guns, more armor, more men to hunt down a formation that did not exist. They were massing against a single Sherman. The overkill was, from Poole's chair, simply more targets driving into the same 200-yard box where Oehler was already laid on. By the time the German army in the West understood what a single well-drilled Sherman crew could do to a road march, in the mood, the 3rd was already rolling toward the German border in the pursuit across France. The name had become a thing the survivors traded warnings about, a white scrawl on a hull that meant the column ahead of you was about to stop existing. They had learned to dread a mass-produced medium tank. What they had not yet worked out was that the tank was the least of their problem. The problem was the man in the commander's hatch and how he had gotten there. In Odom, Texas, the man in that commander's hatch had grown up expecting to fight for a living, just not from inside a tank. Lafayette Greenpool was born in 1919, 6'3", and he came up hard in the way a lot of Depression-era Texans did. He worked oil fields, and he learned to box, and by the time the Army had him, he was very good at both. Boxing mattered here more than it looks. In the ring, Poole learned the thing that would later confuse a German intelligence officer, that the fight is decided by whoever lands first, cleanly, before the other man has finished deciding what to do. A heavyweight who waits to counter gets hit. A heavyweight who reads the tell and moves on, it owns the round. This is not a metaphor. It is the exact instinct that put Aller's rounds into a Panzer IV before the German commander had traversed his own gun. Poole was good enough to reach a national Golden Gloves competition. The details of how far he advanced vary between accounts, but the level is not in dispute. This was a genuine amateur heavyweight with a real shot at the title. For a poor Texan in the 1930s, that was a way out. A trophy, maybe a name, maybe a career. Then the Shermans arrived. Here is where I stop and admire the man, because the choice tells you everything. Poole was in training with the 3rd Armored Division. Word came that a shipment of new tanks had reached his unit while he was away pursuing the boxing title. He could have stayed and fought for the championship. He went back to the tanks. Think about what he traded. A national final is a defined thing, a scheduled bout with a clear reward and a manageable risk of a bloody nose. What he chose instead was a 33-ton steel box that would take him into 81 days of combat, where the losing outcome was not a decision on points. He walked away from personal glory toward anonymous, lethal work. That choice tells you what kind of soldier he was. The boxing did not leave him. It went into the tank with him. Every skill the ring had drilled, the footwork, the timing, the reading of an opponent's weight shift, transferred to the way he ran a fight from the turret. He treated the battlefield the way he treated the ring, watching for the tell, the muzzle beginning to swing, the half-track slowing at a junction, and hitting it before it could set. The Germans kept trying to fight a formation. Poole was fighting them the way a heavyweight fights, one exchange at a time, and winning every exchange. He drilled his crew like a fighter drills combinations, spot, fire, reverse, until none of them had to think it. A boxer who has to think about the jab has already lost the round, and a tank crew that has to think about the firing sequence is already dead. Poole understood that in his body before he ever understood it on paper, and he built the same reflex into 4 other men. The Germans facing him had superb training too, and that is the point worth sitting with. Wehrmacht panzer crews were as professional as any in the war. What they had not trained against was a heavyweight boxer running an American medium tank on ring instincts, pulling the trigger on a timescale their doctrine did not account for. Their competence was real, but it was aimed at the wrong kind of fight. So the ghost in the intelligence reports was neither a ghost nor a formation. He was a Texas heavyweight who had chosen tanks over a title and who fought armor the way he had fought men, fast, first, and without waiting for permission. What that combination did to a German road march is where this turns from training into slaughter. At Detroit, the fight that killed those German columns had already been won before Poole ever laid eyes on a hedgerow. The Chrysler tank arsenal at Warren, Michigan, and the plants feeding it turned out Shermans on assembly lines that had, a few years earlier, been building sedans. By war's end, the United States produced roughly 49,000 M4s of all variants. Germany built about 1,800 Tigers. Sit with those two numbers for a second, because the whole story lives in the gap between them. That gap was the machine behind the man. A Tiger was a magnificent piece of engineering, and I mean that without sarcasm. The 88mm gun and the armor outclassed anything on a Sherman. But a Tiger was hand-built, mechanically temperamental, and effectively irreplaceable. When one broke down, and they broke down often, it stayed broken. When one burned, Germany could not conjure another to take its slot in the line. The Sherman was designed to be the opposite of precious. It was built to be shipped, to be maintained by a 19-year-old with a wrench, and to be replaced without ceremony. That is exactly why Poole could name 3 of them the same thing. When, in the mood the first was disabled, another rolled up from the replacement pool, and he painted the name on again and kept fighting. A German ace who lost his Tiger lost his war. Poole lost his tank and lost, at most, an afternoon. The mythology misses this part. American industry did not just build more tanks. It built a system. The transport ships, the ports, the depots, the recovery vehicles that dragged damaged Shermans back to be welded up and returned. Behind Poole's single turret stood the largest logistics operation any army had ever assembled. The German intelligence officer drawing arrows on his map was not really fighting a Sherman crew. He was fighting Detroit, and Detroit had already decided the arithmetic. Now put the killer crew inside that system, and watch what it does. A single expertly drilled crew is a rare thing in any army, the product of luck and personality, and Poole's refusal to accept men he had not trained himself. In the Wehrmacht by 1944, a crew like that was a diminishing resource because when it was lost, it could not be rebuilt, and its tank could not be replaced. In the American Army, the crew was rare, but the tank behind it was infinite. That combination turned Normandy's hedgerows into a killing ground. The bocage should have favored the defender. Thick earthen banks topped with hedge, narrow lanes, short sightlines. It was terrain built for ambush, and the Germans used it well against green American units in the first weeks. Poole inverted it. Those same 200-yard sightlines that let a hidden anti-tank gun kill a Sherman also meant that a crew who fired first, at that range, killed everything in view before it could react. The terrain rewarded exactly the skill Poole had drilled into muscle memory. And behind him, always, the replacement stream. He could take risks a German commander could not afford, push into a column, trade fire at knife range, because the worst realistic outcome was a bailed-out crew and a new Sherman by morning. The German facing him was betting an irreplaceable machine and an irreplaceable crew on every exchange. Poole was betting an afternoon. When one side can lose cheaply and the other cannot, aggression is not courage. It is just arithmetic. That is the release, and it is a cold one. The German army did not lose to a better tank. It lost to a good enough tank, produced in numbers that made a superb crew nearly consequence-free to risk, handed to a man who fought like every round was the only round that mattered. The intelligence officer never had a chance of solving his puzzle because the answer was not on his map. It was on an assembly line in Michigan. The lead vehicle in the German column had just cleared a bend near Frommental when it stopped existing. Ohler's first round hit the engine deck, and the half-track behind it slammed into the wreck before its driver understood what he was looking at. In the turret, Poole was already calling the next target. It happened faster than the men on the road could process. The crew had already broken the sequence down. Poole rode high in the commander's hatch, exposed, scanning ahead of the tank with binoculars for the tell. The glint of a gun shield, the dust of a moving column, the muzzle of a panzer beginning to creep toward them. He would spot, call the range and the target, and Ohler would already be laying the 75 before the words finished. Del Boggs on the loader's rounds fed the breech without being told which shell. The whole cycle, spot to kill, ran in a handful of seconds. Speed was survival, and it was also slaughter. A German gun crew that gets 3 seconds to react is dangerous. A German gun crew that gets none is dead, and Poole's whole method existed to deny them those 3 seconds. He fought the way he had boxed, reading the opponent's weight shift and landing before the shift completed. That method did something specific to a road march. A German column strung out on a Norman lane was a line of vehicles that could each only see the one ahead of it. Poole would take the front and the rear first, corking both ends of the road, and then work the trapped middle at leisure. Men bailed out of burning half-tracks into hedgerows they could not fire through. The smell of it, diesel, cordite, scorched rubber, the particular Swedish reek of a brewed-up vehicle, hung in those lanes for hours, after in the mood had already moved on. The numbers are where the arithmetic becomes a body count. Over 81 days of combat from Normandy to the German border, Poole's crew was credited with destroying or disabling more than 250 vehicles, killing or wounding roughly 1,000 enemy soldiers, and capturing hundreds more, 12 enemy tanks and assault guns among them. Those figures come from his eventual Distinguished Service Cross citation and the division's records, and even allowing for the fog that inflates every combat tally, the scale is staggering for a single tank. The pace those figures imply is worth dwelling on. 250 vehicles in 81 days is a killed vehicle every 8 hours of the entire campaign, sleep and rain and refit included. In the days of actual contact, the rate was far higher. A single Sherman crew was doing to the German rear what an airstrike was supposed to do, and doing it again the next morning. The Germans adjusted, and this is the part I respect. They learned the name. They learned to fear the white script. They began committing anti-tank guns and armor specifically to the sector where the ghost kept appearing. Their competence was real, and their reaction was rational. It was simply too slow. By the time a German commander had massed enough force to trap one Sherman, Poole had already fought through 6 other engagements in 6 other places, and every gun pulled forward to hunt him was a gun not defending the line the rest of the 3rd Armored was breaking. That is the horror of it from the German side. You could not outshoot the crew because they fired first. You could not outmaneuver them because Poole read the ground like a ring. You could not wait them out because Detroit kept sending fresh Shermans, and you could not even kill the tank without buying it at a price the Wehrmacht of 1944 could not pay twice. For 81 days, nothing the German army put in front of that hull stopped it. What finally stopped in the mood was not a better plan. It was a single lucky round on a hill near the German border in September. On the German side of the line, near the Belgian border in early September, the after-action language starts to bend in a way that tells you more than any casualty figure. A defending unit does not write that it was beaten by one tank. It writes that it was struck by an armored thrust, that its flank was overrun, that it faced a strong American armored element. Read enough of these, and a pattern emerges. The size of the force in the report grows in direct proportion to how badly Poole's single Sherman had hurt the man writing it. This is not the Germans lying. It is the Germans reasoning honestly from bad evidence. A gun crew that loses its weapon and half its men in 4 seconds does not conclude it was outfought by one commander. It concludes it walked into something larger because nothing in its training allowed for the alternative. Think about what a German infantry company on a road actually experienced. The lead vehicle brews up, and a heartbeat later, the tail vehicle goes too. Fire comes into the trapped middle from a single point that keeps firing faster than one gun should be able to fire. From inside that column, this reads as an ambush by multiple tanks. The reality was one Sherman and a loader who could feed the breach in his sleep. The intelligence collators had the same problem, one level up. When the same Sherman appears in 3 sector reports on the same day, kills a column here at dawn and a gun line there by afternoon, the map does not say one gifted crew. The map says the 3rd Armored has more armor in this zone than it should. So the Germans committed force to match a phantom. Anti-tank guns, assault guns, a Panther or two, pulled forward to hunt an armored concentration that did not exist. The consequences ran deeper than the vehicles Poole destroyed. Every 88 dragged to the sector, where In the Mood kept appearing, was an 88 not covering the ground. The rest of the division was actually rolling through. His crew distorted the German picture of where the American weight lay, and the German response to that distorted picture opened the very gaps the 3rd Armored exploited. One tank was writing false intelligence into the enemy's own files. I find the honesty of the German reports more damning than any American claim could be. When a captured officer, or a war diary, or a defending commander's account inflates the attacking force, that is the enemy testifying under oath to how it felt. The proof is not that Americans said Poole was deadly. The proof is that the men on the receiving end could not make his kill count fit a single tank, so they invented a bigger enemy to explain their own dead. There is a grim comedy buried in it. Somewhere in the German rear, staff officers were allocating scarce armor and irreplaceable anti-tank guns to counter a threat that was one 33-ton Sherman with a Texas heavyweight in the hatch. They were fighting a division-sized Ghost. The Ghost was 5 men and a 75mm gun. By the 2nd week of September, that arithmetic had pushed the crew hard into Germany itself, ahead of much of the division, into the kind of exposed forward position where the odds finally stopped being in your favor. Poole had spent 81 days being the thing that appeared where it should not, hit before it could be hit, and vanished before the counterstroke landed. He had made the German command see armies where there was a squad. The records show a crew that had killed past the point where its enemy could even count it correctly. What they do not show is any German who solved the puzzle in time. That solution, when it came not from a staff officer with a map, but from a single anti-tank gunner on a hill near Müsterbush, waiting in the dark for a tank he could not see yet. August 17th, near Fromental, and the thing that finally killed In the Mood. The 2nd came out of the one direction Poole could not read. Not a hedgerow, not a dug-in 88. It came from above, from the American sky, wearing a white star. The German pocket at Falaise was closing that day, and the roads inside it were solid with fleeing Wehrmacht columns, exactly the target Poole had spent the whole campaign hunting. He pushed into it hard, the way he always did, brewing up vehicles faster than the men on the road could scatter. Above him, P-38 Lightnings were working the same roads from 12,000 feet, hunting the same columns. From that altitude, a Sherman in the middle of a burning German convoy is a shape on a road. The twin-boomed fighter that peeled off and rolled in on In the Mood was doing its job. That is the part that stays with me. Nobody blundered. The pilot saw armor in a killing zone and attacked armor in a killing zone, and the armor happened to be the deadliest tank in the American Army. The accounts of the exact ordnance conflict, a bomb by some accounts, strafing and rockets by others. What the records agree on is the result. The attack that came down on Poole's crew on August 17th came from a friendly aircraft, and it wrecked the tank. Then the flash. The concussion slammed the hull, the fighting compartment filled with the choke of it, and in the mood. The second was finished on a road it had come to burn. The crew got out. 81 days of enemy fire had never opened that hull, and it took a P-38 from their own Air Force to do it. If you want the war's black humor distilled into one moment, it is Lafayette Poole climbing out of a tank that the entire Wehrmacht could not kill, knocked out by a man on the same side who never even saw his face. Sit with the irony for a second, because it is the whole thesis in a single strike. The Germans had thrown Panthers and gun lines and massed anti-tank fire at this crew and put none of it through the armor. The one force that finally reached Poole was the same overwhelming American machine that had made him unstoppable in the first place, the air power saturating every road in the pocket, so total that it occasionally chewed up its own. The system that made him invincible against the enemy was the only thing large enough to touch him. And here is the part that should end any argument about what made this man dangerous. Poole did not go to the rear, and he did not take the survivor's pass a wrecked tank earns you. He walked to the replacement pool, drew in the mood the third, painted the two words on the hull in the same white script, and took his crew back into the line. That is the machine, and the man fused into one image. A German ace who lost his tank, lost his war. Poole lost his second, in the mood to friendly fire in the Falaise pocket, and had a third one under him within days, because Detroit had already built it, and the man in the hatch refused to stop. The replacement stream that made his aggression cheap was standing behind him even now, handing him another chance to appear where he should not. The Germans never solved him. They inflated him into a division, pulled guns forward to hunt a phantom, and testified in their own war diaries to a force that was 5 men and a 75. What finally knocked out in the mood the second was not their solution. It was the sky that belonged to his own side, so crowded with American aircraft that one of them mistook the deadliest Sherman on the road for just another enemy tank. He got a third. He kept fighting. At Müsterbush, on the western edge of Germany near Aachen, the ground finally turned against him. This was the Siegfried Line, the West Wall, concrete and dragon's teeth, and prepared positions the Wehrmacht had spent years pouring into the hills. For 81 days, Poole had fought in country, where he could keep moving and keep appearing, denying the enemy those 3 seconds. Here, the Germans knew exactly where the road went, because they had built the ground. It was the night of September 19th, 1944. In the mood, the third pushed forward in the dark, along a road that climbed toward the German positions, and somewhere on the high ground ahead, a Panther crew was already laid in, with the muzzle trained on that exact stretch of road. Poole had spent his whole campaign being the gun that fired first. On this hill, for the first time, someone else held that timing. The first round came out of the dark and hit the Sherman in the front. 75 millimeters of long-barreled German gun at close range, and the hull shuddered under the impact. Wilbert Richards, the gunner, the man in the seat where Oehler and then his replacements had put 250 vehicles on the ground, was hit. The account is that Richards was killed at his station by that first strike. Then, the second round. The Panther gunner fired again before the crew could recover, and this hit did what 81 days of German fire had never managed. The impact was low, and it was violent, and it flipped the tank. 33 tons of Sherman went over. Poole, riding high in the commander's hatch the way he always had, exposed the way he had always chosen to be, was thrown clear as the tank rolled. He was blown from the turret onto the ground beside a burning tank in the dark, in Germany, with a German gun line above him. His right leg was gone below the knee, or nearly so. The wound would cost him the leg. He lay there while the Sherman burned, and the surviving crew dragged themselves out, and the Panther crew, somewhere up the slope, had every reason to think the job was finished. The exposed position that had made him deadly, the high hatch that let him spot the tell before anyone else, had put him exactly where a flipping tank throws its commander. Look at what it took. This was no clever German staff officer solving the puzzle, and it was no massed counterattack. It took the Germans getting to fire first at night, from ground they had prepared, with a tank gun that could punch a Sherman, and it took 2 hits, back to back, faster than Poole's crew could answer. The very method the crew had used on every German column near Fromental was turned around and used on them, on that hill, in the dark. The first shot, then the second before they could recover, and then their commander on the ground. I keep coming back to the symmetry of it. Poole had corked road after road by killing the lead vehicle, and then hitting again before anyone could react. At Müsterbush, a German gunner did the identical thing to him. Whoever that Panther commander was, he fought the fight Poole had taught the whole sector to fear, and for once, he was the one who landed first. The records on the exact sequence are thin, as night actions usually are. Sources give the 2-hit account and the flip tank and the leg, and they agree Richards died in the tank. The minute-by-minute is gone, the way it always is, when a tank brews up in the dark and the survivors are fighting to live rather than taking notes. What is not in question is the arithmetic that ended here. 81 days, over 250 vehicles, 12 tanks and assault guns, a crew the German command inflated into an armored division because the truth was harder to write down. It ended on a hillside at the west wall, with the commander thrown into the mud beside his burning tank, 1 round too late to fire back. They were still arguing about it years after the guns went quiet, in the interrogation rooms and the writing offices where the U.S. Army Historical Division had captured German generals set down what had beaten them. Read those foreign military studies now, and you notice something. They almost never talk about American aces. That is the thing that should stop you. Poole was the most decorated tank commander of his war, and the men on the other end of his gun did not remember him by name. What they remembered was the pattern, that you could kill an American tank, kill its crew, flip it into a ditch on a prepared hillside, and another one came up the road with the same 2 words painted on the hull. That is a different kind of fear than fearing a man. The Germans understood individual brilliance. Their whole armored doctrine was built around it, around the gifted panzer commander who racked up kills the way Poole did. What they could not model was the thing standing behind him. Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer Lehr Division and fought the Americans across Normandy and the West Wall, kept circling the same complaint in his post-war accounts. Not that the American soldier outfought him, but that he was crushed by material, by an avalanche of equipment that never thinned. The Americans, one German assessment ran, make good their lack of experience by their lavish use of material. They meant it as a criticism. Listen to what they were actually admitting. They were admitting they had no answer. A German commander who lost a Panther that might not be replaced for weeks, if ever. Poole lost. In the mood, then. In the mood the second. Then rolled forward in a third within days each time, because Detroit had already built the replacement before the old one burned. The system did not grieve its losses. It simply restocked them. And that is the resolution of the whole puzzle the intelligence officer could not solve back in Normandy. He kept looking for a bigger American force on his map because he was reasoning like a German. One exceptional tank, one exceptional man, findable, killable, and then the threat is gone. He never grasped that the terrifying thing was not the ghost Sherman. It was that the ghost Sherman was disposable. You could destroy it and change nothing. I think that is why the captured generals talk about material instead of men. Not because they missed the courage of the American crews. They had felt it up close on every road out of Falaise. They talk about material because material was the part that broke their minds. A brave enemy you can respect and hope to outfight. An enemy who is brave and infinitely replaced you cannot fight at all. You can only lose to him, slowly. Picture the German gunner at Müsterbush on the morning of September 20th, looking down the slope at the burned-out hull he had flipped in the dark. He had done everything right. He fired first. He fired twice. He killed the gunner and wrecked the tank and put the commander in the mud with his leg gone. By every rule of his own war, he had won that fight. And the American line kept coming up the road anyway, past the wreck, into Germany, because one dead Sherman did not matter to the machine that had sent it. That is the enemy's own verdict on American armor, and it is more damning than any medal citation. What they feared was not Lafayette Poole, but what he was riding. The country that could hand a Texas heavyweight 3 tanks in 81 days and never notice the cost. The assembly line in Michigan that had beaten Ponceau before Bayerline ever saw a hedgerow. The generals wrote it down themselves. They lost to material. They just never admitted whose factories, whose replacement pool, whose refusal to run dry had put that word in their mouths. The Germans stopped Lafayette Poole. They never stopped what he came from. That distinction is the whole story, and the ambush at Müsterbush is where you can finally see it clean. On the night of September 19th, a Panther crew did everything the entire Wehrmacht had failed to do for 81 days. They fired first, they fired twice, they killed the gunner and flipped the tank and put the commander on the ground with a leg he would lose. By every measure a German armor officer used to keep score, they had won, and it changed the direction of the war in that sector by exactly nothing. 3rd Armored kept rolling toward Aachen. The replacement Shermans kept coming up the same road the Panther had been guarding. Poole went to the rear this time, because a man missing a leg does not draw a fourth in the mood. He was evacuated, the leg came off, and the most decorated tank commander in the United States Army spent the end of the war in hospitals instead of hedgerows. His personal count, when the paperwork settled, stood at over 250 enemy vehicles destroyed or knocked out, 12 of them tanks and assault guns, along with 1,000 prisoners taken and hundreds of enemy dead. He earned a Distinguished Service Cross, and decades later, the record was reviewed, and that award was upgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross a second time, and eventually pressed toward the Medal of Honor consideration that his supporters argued he had always deserved. The Army had trouble scoring him too, in its own way. This is what closes the puzzle the German intelligence officer opened in Normandy. He had gone looking for a larger force because he could not accept that one crew was doing the damage. He was half right, and he never knew it. A larger force did stand behind that Sherman, but it was on no road he could shell. It sat in Warren, Michigan, on the assembly lines that had built 49,000 Shermans, while Germany built roughly 6,000 Panthers. The ghost tank he hunted was real and disposable at the same time, and that was what he could not fit on his map. Poole lived until 1991. He stayed in the Army, made warrant officer, taught, and by most accounts talked about the crew more than himself. Aller on the gun, Boggs driving, the men who did the aiming while he read the road. The tank commander who terrified a German sector spent his later decades as a quiet warrant officer in Texas, and the machine that made him never even paused to notice he was gone. The month Poole was flipped into the mud at Müsterbush. American factories were still turning out armor faster than the front could lose it. The war would grind another 8 months, and across every one of them, the replacement stream did exactly what it had done for Poole 3 times over. It handed the next crew the next tank, and the next after that, until there was no German army left to fire first. 20 years after Müsterbush, the men who had lost to that stream were the ones who explained it best. In those foreign military studies, the U.S. Army had them right. They did not write about a Texas boxer in a turret. They wrote about the flood. Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded panzers against the Americans and knew exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that machine, put the German verdict as plainly as any of them ever did. "We could beat the American soldier," he said. "We could not beat his equipment."